is now 10:50, so we will resume the meeting. And for now, we have scheduled a short Q&A sessions. However, we have only one comment and two questions, which is actually quite good because we've been running a little bit behind time. So I would just like to quote the comment that came from Naira from Armstad at the beginning of the session, when she mentioned that they are also working on air accounts, and as mentioned by Olivier, the transport is the most challenging sector. However, they have found a compromise for using statistics on air emission, IPCC, and CLR TAP inventories. Further, we have on the chat two questions, as I understand, for Peter. So if we could reconnect Peter to answer, and I would just read out. The first question is from Eugene Itua. Is the full carbon inventory model accessible to the public? And the second question is whether Australia uses the IPCC guidelines in computing the carbon stock of mangrove, seagrass, salt marsh, and kelp related to the blue carbon ocean ecosystem. I hope we can have Peter back. Yes, and we can hear him. Excellent.
That's awesome. Okay. To answer the first question, the full carbon inventory model is, well, the methodology and metadata that they use for the model are accessible to the public. If you search on full carbon accounting model, or FULCAM, it should pop up there fairly quickly. I'm happy to be contacted if you can't find it. When we do outreach to other countries on sort of carbon accounting, there is another model that they promote, and I can't think of the name at the moment. So if you do want to find out more about this, feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to pass you on to the people who do this, or to find out the information as quickly as I can. On the second question, I think the shorter answer is indirectly. We will be using the same model, so that full carbon accounting model, to actually produce some stocks of salt marsh and mangroves, but we're modifying the methodology mainly due to the fact that the carbon accounting model is designed to measure disturbance in those ecosystems, not measure the actual stock of those ecosystems. But through that disturbance model, we think we can produce full carbon stock models of mangrove, seagrass, and salt marsh. Kelp is a challenge. That's something that we will probably need to reach out to science, to our universities, to see if we can come up with an answer. The full CAM model follows the IPCC guidelines, in particular the sort of the derivation to the UNFCCC methodology. So those two are fairly consistent. So that's about as close as an answer you can get at this point. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Peter. I can see for the moment there are no other questions. So in that case, we are going to proceed to the last presentation of today. And after that, all the speakers will come back for the panel discussion. So if you have any additional questions, please, you can still put them on the chat and we'll try to handle them during the panel discussion. So Angelica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gosha. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can see it. We can hear you well.
Okay. So now, similarly to what we have done with the energy-related indicators, we will focus on only a couple of those. and try and explain their main features and how also to communicate the data a little bit. So similarly, as I said, to the case of energy-related indicators, we have selected only 2 out of the total list of emission-related indicators selected for the UNECE core indicators list. And in this case, we selected total greenhouse gas emissions indicators. But they, as you see here, we have in the list 2 different indicators for total greenhouse gas emissions. Why is that? Why do we need to have both? This is exactly what we will try to understand in this presentation that will present these 2 indicators. But of course, bear in mind that the list is not limited to these 2 indicators, but instead, let's have a look very quickly. We also want to see how much of the emissions come from combustion activities. You see is the third indicators, both from a national economy point of view and from a national territory point of view. We want to see the role that land use and land use change plays in this picture. And also we want to select production activities and see how much is their contribution, both in terms of total emissions and in terms of intensity, again, as we saw with energy indicators. And also we would like to see the separate contribution from households. Finally, we would like also to use our data on energy accounts to do a bit of modeling and calculate the carbon footprint of individual countries. But then again, let's focus on these 2 indicators, and because really they have something in common, of course, the fact that they indicate, calculate how much greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by the country in total. It might be useful to have a look at the metadata of the 2 indicators we are dealing with together, jointly. And this is exactly what is done in this slide and in the following one, where we present together in the same table the metadata of the 2 indicators whose number is 9A and 9B, respectively. The first one relating to total greenhouse gases emitted from our national economy, and the second one is total greenhouse gas emissions emitted when the national territory is your point of view. From the indicator definition and the as well as from the spatial aggregation, you can see where the main difference lies. The difference is your reference framework. In the case of the first indicator, you want to measure the emissions caused by all residents of a national economy. Now, we are going to see in a moment the definition of residents in a detailed way from national accounts, and that, of course, applies to environmental accounts. Of course, is valid for environmental accounts as well. Part of this detailed definition is also reported in the metadata. So what are they? They are people, group of people that can be grouped depending on their role played in the economy. They can be households, they can be corporations, government units. And what they have in common, that they have a predominant center of economic interest in a given economy. We will see again what this means in practice by looking at the more detailed definition of national accounts. If you compare this scope of this indicator with the one of the indicator 9b, you can see that the reference framework in this case is not the economy, but is the national territory. And so the emissions that are of interest here are those that are caused by all the activities that take place on the national territory, rather than that they are caused by residents of the economy. Having said that, it's obvious from the different scope that also the breakdown that you can have starting from this total calculation of emission is different, because if you adopt a national economy point of view, then you can see in more detail what is the contribution of specific economic sectors classified by ISIC, or the contribution of households, because that is the feature of the accounts. They have this kind of breakdowns by construction. Whereas if you adopt a national territory point of view, then what you will be able to produce, if you want to adopt a more detailed breakdown, is to look at what sectors are responsible for the emissions. And in this case, the classification is the IPCC classification adopted for the greenhouse gas inventories. In both cases, of course, you might be able to produce a spatial breakdown, so to produce data not at the level of the national economy as a whole, or the national territory as a whole, but for example by NUTS2 or NUTS3 even regions. When you come to the description of what these indicators trying to measure, apart from this fundamental difference between national economy and national territory, of course, the emissions themselves are the same. And I think that there was also a pre-recorded video that was one of the reference videos that all participants were invited to see before this seminar, that was explaining also quite clearly that greenhouse gas emissions are calculated as a weighted average of individual greenhouse gases, and here you can see a list of which gases are actually the object of our measuring. Most of you may be familiar with these, but in case you are not, the metadata of the indicator provide this list. So we have carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then perfluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, complicated things, nitrogen trifluoride. And because we want to have a single indicators, we cannot simply add the emissions in tons of these different gases, but we have to measure them in a common unit that is by taking into account their global warming potential, their potential contribution to global warming, and the scientific community provides specific conversion factors for that are reported in the metadata. Okay. Okay. Now, I always found this picture that is taken by the Eurostat Air Emission Accounts compilation guide very clear to understand what is the main difference between indicators that represent total greenhouse gas emissions from a national economy point of view to those that instead adopt a national territory reference point. You can see in the high left corner that these two approaches have something in common. So they both include emissions on national territory by resident units. But then there are items that make the difference between the two. On the one hand, if you want to represent the emission from the national economy, then you also want to include in your indicator the emission of resident units that operate abroad. What are they? Take the example of a truck so owned by a resident company in your country. If these trucks operates abroad, for example, operates transport between two foreign countries, then its emissions will be included in the air emission accounts and in your indicator based on the national economy, because that trucks belong to the national economy, and it's the value added generated by that activity is included in the national accounts. So for this reason, the national economy is held responsible for those emissions, and even though they take place abroad. On the other hand, if you take into account all the emissions occurring on the territory, of course, the same example of the truck will be referring to an item that is, of course, not taken into account in the inventories and the indicators derived from them that take this perspective of the national territory, simply because those emissions are not happening on the territory. Whereas part of the emissions that are occurring on your national territory might come from trucks, again, in this example, that are owned by foreign companies. And so they are operating for a certain amount of time in your country, but they are not part of the resident units, so their value added generated by their activity will not be part of the national accounts, and the corresponding emissions also will not be part of the accounts, but they will be considered in the inventories and indicators derived from them because they occur in the territories. So as you see, the main difference, as we said before, in the case of energy, relates to transport activities. And then it's always important to bear in mind when you start calculating these items that it is important to focus on the transport activities that are most important for your countries. Of course, not all of them might occur, not all of them might have the same importance. We heard the case of Luxembourg, which is probably different from the case of Norway, and so the hint for countries that are starting the calculation of these indicators is always to ask themselves what is the transport mode that is most relevant for their countries, and start, of course, from that. As I was saying, it might be useful to see a little bit more in detail what is the definition of resident units in national accounts, because of course in environmental accounts we always want to be consistent with that. And I took here a reference to the manual of the European system of national and regional accounts in the European Union. Of course, this is valid in Europe, but it's consistent as far as these definitions are concerned with the international manual, that is the SNA, the System of National Accounts, so you might as well refer to that. If you read the paragraph 2.4, it tells you exactly that the national accounts refer to units, to resident units. How do you determine the residence of different institutional units? By looking at what is the economic territory where the unit as a center of predominant economic interest. By contrast, it's not the nationality that is relevant, it's not the legal form or the presence on the economic territory at the time a specific transaction is carried out. It is the residence what is important. This is why in the example we were making beforehand, the example of a truck, you might include the value added generated by the activity of a truck, a resident of a specific economy, even when that activity is performed outside of the economic territory of this residence, because the territory in which the truck temporarily operates it doesn't become a center of predominant economic interest. It's only a temporary presence there, but the center of predominant economic interest remains the one where it is resident. By contrast, if you have a firm belonging to a multinational company, for example, but you have a firm with, of course, an establishment with people employed and so on and so forth, of course, that firm, irrespectively of the nationality, has a center of predominant economic interest in their country, and so it will be accounted for in national accounts, and it will be also accounted for in environmental accounts. So we will take into account both the value added generated and the emissions generated. Okay. Now, what does it mean for air emission accounts? As we saw in the case of energy, the implication mostly concerns transport emissions. And so what we are really interested in is who operates the transport activities. So the emissions are assigned to the operator of transport vehicles, and that is the basis. Who operates the truck, or who operates an airplane or a ship, that becomes the really most important variables to look at to assign the emissions. And this paragraph, as you see, is taken from the Air Emission Accounts 2015 compilation guide that of course is valid in Europe and explains the implications of adopting the residence principle for air emission accounts very, very well and very clearly to me. Okay, then again, when you present the information as it was done in the case of Luxembourg, due to the fact that, of course, we have two different perspectives and that the official numbers used for international negotiations comes from the emission inventory totals rather than emission accounts, then it is always very important to present this information together, the two perspectives together, so that the user understands where the difference comes from. And this is an example taken from the Eurostat database that, of course, also publishes total air emissions by resident units, as well as the total derived from emission inventories and reported for international negotiations and international conventions, as well as the so-called bridging items, that is the items that explain the difference between the two. So you can see in the first row, in the case of Italy for 2019, the amount of air emissions generated by the national economy, so that includes production activities and households. And in the last row, the same number, but derived from the inventories and consistent with the requirement of the international conventions. And in between these two, you will see all the items that explain the difference and that relate, as explained in the previous slides, to the transport items that are included in the emissions of resident units when, of course, when the transport emissions are caused by resident units, whereas they are excluded from the air emissions of the national economy when they are related to the activities of non-resident units. Okay, and again, with reference to the Eurostat database, what I think is interesting to see is that we always have this double reporting. I mean, the choice that was done by the UNECE to report both indicators, of course, shows that the importance of both sources needs to be acknowledged, that the user really want to see the two different sources together and, of course, understand their relation in the form of bridge table. So, I mean, a number of course of international databases are taking the same approach. So also here in the Eurostat database, you can have access to emissions disaggregated by source sector, so consistent with the IPCC classification, as well as disaggregated by NEIS activity, so consistent with the classification. I remind you that the NEIS is the equivalent of ISIC. And then again, just to sum up, we saw which are the main differences between inventories and accounts relating to the total we saw that in one case, that the case of inventories, we have this focus on the territory, so emissions are assigned to the country where actually the emissions are occurring, whereas in the accounts we have the approach of the resident cause of the emissions. One thing that we did not look at, because we are focusing on total indicators, is the classification, but you saw, I think, something relating to the breakdown into economic activities in the other tutorials that were made available. And we also got some reference to it. Of course, if you look at the breakdown, on the one hand, you have a reference to processes, and on the other hand, you are able to classify the emissions by economic activities. And then I think we can skip the detail on shipping and aviation on that. And with that, my presentation is finished. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer possible questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And so now we move to the final segment of today's webinar, and that will be a panel discussion moderated by my colleague Michael Nagy from the UNECE Statistical Division. And in addition to all of today's speakers you've heard so far, we will have one more person, new panelist, Mr. Arturo de la Fuente of Eurostat. Arturo works in Eurostat as Deputy Head of Unit Environmental Statistics and Accounts, Sustainable Development. He's in charge of environmental accounts in Eurostat and has worked there for 20 years, and previously he worked in the National Statistical Office of Spain. So with that, I hand over to Michael, who will moderate that part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gosha, and I hope you can hear me well. Like yesterday, we have a bit of challenge with the panel discussion because we cannot have all panelists at the same time on stage. So we might have to jump a little bit back and forth. So we have to, I think we can put a maximum of 3 panelists at the same time on stage. And when we ask the other ones to stream, we have to stop streaming of 1 or 2 of you. So I hope this goes well. And also considering that we're running a bit late, I think we will simply pack a few questions to the panelists together, and I would like to invite them to respond to these questions relatively briefly, coming to the point, but also at the same time comprehensively, if this is possible. I would like to invite first Olivier, Angelica, and Tekshi to raise their hands so that we can bring them on the floor. So I would like to ask my colleagues to start streaming. And while you are doing this, I would like to show again the results of our Mentimeter question and also the results of today's Mentimeter question as a kind of introduction into this discussion. Olivier has raised his hand now. So Olivier, if you could also please be streamed. So to start this discussion, I would like to recall what was the feedback from the Mentimeter question. So I think we have quite an experienced audience today and also yesterday. About 2/3 of those who replied to the Mentimeter said that they have at least some experience in producing climate change related statistics and indicators. And coming back to the Mentimeter question of today, I think this is also very interesting to see. We asked, according to your experience, is SEEA used to its full potential for producing climate change related statistics indicators in your country? And I think it's interesting to see that many experts think that the relevant SEEA accounts are actually available for them, and they're used, fully used or partially used. That's what I think half of them are saying, but others are saying relevant SEEA accounts are partially available but not used. So I think it's looking at this picture not a matter of not having the SEEA accounts available, it's more a matter of making them useful for climate change related statistics. So I would like to start with this question to the panelists. How do you interpret these results? Does it come as a surprise to you? Is there anything you would like to add? But maybe you would also like to respond to the question, according to your experience, what do you think are the main advantages and disadvantages of using SEEA for informing climate change? Because what we have heard from your presentations is also it might result in a list of indicators, which is a mix of maybe territory-based indicators, residency-based indicators, which might be also a challenge from the user's point of view to understand. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that in 4 minutes maximum. So first question, how do you interpret these results? And where do you see the advantages, but maybe also some disadvantages of using SEEA for informing climate change information? Maybe we can start with Olivier, then Angelica, and then Tekshi. Olivier, what do you think?
Yes, I'm surprised by the results because I have first the impression that the viability of environmental account will be the main reason why we do not calculate indicator on climate change. But it's a good news that it's aviable or partly aviable. Perhaps one difficulties, and it could be that environmental account is quite difficult to produce and also difficult to explain. And in history of producing statistics, energy statistics is quite old, I will say. We produce that more than 30 years. And now we talk about environmental account, which is quite new for many countries. So I think that this could be one reason why we should continue to work as statisticians and economists to develop this account. And in terms of consistency, clearly, I think that our presentation show that we need to use this statistics if we make some analysis with economic data. And this is, for me, the main advantages is that after to just present the key indicator, you could go further with operational indicator and very interesting analysis and clearly give information to help policymakers in their decision for measure, for example, for low carbon economy as presented by Peter. The main difficulty or disadvantages for me is for the availability of the data. Waiting 2 years to obtain a value, it's not acceptable for policymakers. And it's perhaps why policymakers prefer to use more up-to-date statistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. Angelica, what do you think? How do you interpret this and what are your experiences?
Yeah, I'm also, I'm not very surprised that the SEA accounts are only partially used or not used at all, even though when they are available, because as Olivier was saying, there is a certain inertia in the information systems, and especially due to the fact that the requirements of some reporting, the metadata of some reporting are based on statistics and not on the accounts. So if countries start to produce SDGs indicators and they produce a report based on that, of course they will read the metadata and start producing the indicators on the basis of the statistics in most cases, and so the question will naturally arise: why do we have to produce a different set of indicators to present the same phenomena. So it's there is still this sort of competition in place, and that naturally leads to a suboptimal use of the accounts. Our experience is that the acceptance of the accounts is related to understanding their potential for analysis. So once the users understand the kind of analysis that you can make, like decomposition, carbon footprints, and all these kind of things, then it becomes easier for them to accept them. And they ask for this kind of information. And of course, also the breakdown, I mean, understanding that the breakdown by economic activities is only possible with this source. This makes the demand higher. Okay, so for not so much for the total indicators that we just saw, but more for breakdown and more for the use of the data for analysis. That is our experience.
Thank you, Angelica. Tekshi, so how do you interpret these results, and what is your main takeaway from working with basically energy accounts for climate change information in terms of advantages and disadvantages?
Okay.
Yours.
My answer is partially availability for these questions. And in my opinion, the main advantage of using SEEA for the informing climate change is we can identify who is influenced more on the climate change, then policy will be more effectively and more targeted. Disadvantage is the time constraint. It takes time to compile the accounts. It lasts very long time. This is the disadvantage. The second question is, in my experience, when we produce any indicators, we need the reliable and timely data so that we think about from the where we can get the data. If data is good, then we estimate the good indicators. In some countries, it is difficult to collect data. It needed more money and more finance. Therefore, the international organization helped them in terms of finance and new technology. New technology means that new methods data collections, like CATI and CAFI is something like that. Thank you. Thank you. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. So we will continue with the next two panelists. So I would like to ask Peter from Australia and also Arturo to raise their hands, and we might need to stop streaming of one or two of the other speakers. So I see Peter is already connected. So Peter, what's your takeaway from these results, and how would you see, according to experiences, the major advantages and disadvantages of using SEEA for informing climate change policies?
Excellent. This result doesn't actually surprise me in the slightest. We've been spending a lot of time through the UN Committee of Experts to try and implement SEEA, and it's good to see that it's actually working. It reminds me of something we discovered in the Pacific regions. We call it the curse of advanced statistical systems, where if you have countries that have many different statistical systems, then they tend to pick and choose which one they want. Whereas countries that don't have relatively advanced statistical systems, they will only use the one that's available. So there's a fair chance that some of those relevant accounts and only being used are probably those ones that's the only data they've got, which is a great space to be in if you're an environment accountant. In terms of advantages and disadvantages, I don't see any real disadvantages to using SEA, but I do see a lot of challenges, and those are the ones I'll probably talk through now. So timeliness, which has been fairly well mentioned, and I guess the solution to that is borrowing techniques from national accounts, which we tend to feel reluctant to do for some reason. Why can't we benchmark and produce estimates based on leading indicators? I mean, it's a standard practice for most national statistical organisations doing GDP estimates. Statistical or accounting literacy is a bit of a challenge at the moment. The SE tables aren't exactly what I'd say plain language for any country at this particular point in time. So people trying to understand what characteristic producers of connected products and things like that, it's difficult to get them to understand what on earth you're talking about. A simple solution there is maybe we should be writing more stories. Maybe we should be thinking about use cases. Maybe we should talk to our stakeholders before we actually publish a table and see what they actually need and head down that pathway. And the last one is need. I think there's a challenge of need. Again, that curse of advanced data systems is one of those things, but it's really engaging with policy early on as it develops and ensuring that we have a nice solid base available, and that discussion takes place with the knowledge that we can actually produce information at a fairly quick pace. That suits what the need is, rather than developing new statistical systems, which are not very cost effective, to be honest. Some of the advantages of SEA, just if you indulge me for a few secs, it's probably the best source of indicators that we have. And in fact, the group of sort of economic and social and environmental standards are ideal for producing indicators. They just need translation into something that's quite plain for the language that you're speaking with. Integration is ideal for SEA. We can mix energy, water, land concepts all together because they're measured in much the same way, even at a very, very basic level, even though hectares and petajoules and gigaliters don't really mix very well, but we can at least report it. If you look at chapter 6 in the standards, there's a wonderful range of things that you can produce. And lastly, but not least, it's a great source of input for economic modelling. The sort of reconciliation with national accounts is ideal for feeding into sort of understanding how we change policy settings at an economic sense from a fiscal or a structural perspective, and what impact it's likely to have. That should do me for now.
Thank you, Peter. And last but not least in this round, we have Arturo from Eurostat. And Arturo, I would like to invite you to also interpret what you have seen, what you have heard. But I also would like to give you the opportunity to update us a little bit on what Eurostat is actually doing in terms of statistics and indicators for climate change. And I'm sure you also have to say something about the role of SEEA in that regard. Arturo,
okay,
please.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning. First, I want to comment on the graph, and in particular, in the one aspect, one reading of the graph is that the SEEA accounts are partially available or fully available, but they are not fully used. And I want to reinforce some of the things that my colleagues said before, in particular from Europe and Australia. Of course, I have a similar viewpoint as them. One difficulty is communication. It's we need to communicate in the right way because, for instance, SEEA accounts normally should not be used to measure the total emissions of greenhouse gases because there are other reporting information systems for that. But we rather need to look to a different angle to explain how to use the accounts to understand the relation of production and consumption with climate change, and that requires a different way of communicating. And frequently, the people who produce the accounts are not good communicators. You need different people with different skills, so complementary teams. This is something we have observed in Eurostat. We really need two teams of people working together, one group producing the numbers and another group telling the stories. And each of the teams cannot do a good job without the other. Something else is about the timeliness. Olivier, I think, mentioned it. We need more timely data to be more useful for the users. That's why Eurostat now is producing quarterly greenhouse gas emissions based on SEEA. Now we want to produce this data after 4.5 months. 4.5 months. So we are not going to talk anymore about data of 2019 or 2020. We are going to talk about the data of 21 quarter 3. So it's a completely different type of information for the users. And we want more European countries to do also these things with us, with Eurostat, and we want to help them. Now, another difficulty to use the accounts in full is that sometimes producing the tables is not the end of the story. You need to do a little extra step to make the users understand what to do with these numbers. For instance, calculating carbon footprints. The SEEA accounts allow to calculate carbon footprints, but this requires an extra step. You need to combine the SEEA accounts with input-output tables from national accounts. This is something that Peter mentioned, that we can do that because of the SEEA methodology. And that requires an extra work to produce these footprints. And then to explain to the users what the footprints is and so on, it goes back to the communication. So these 3 challenges are important. As to what Eurostat is doing for this, very quickly, we have handbooks and compilation guidelines in our website for SEEA accounts that are targeted to countries of the European Union, but other countries can also use. And we have results of pilot studies in European countries that are also can be made available to other countries. People interested can contact me. I can put my email in the chat in a moment. And we also have a website. Eurostat has a website dedicated to climate change statistics. If you Google Eurostat climate change, you get to this page. It's a sort of portal where we put together SEEA data and also statistics that are not based on SEEA. We put them together to report about different aspects of climate change, drivers, emitters, etc. And there are also interactive tools, graphs where users can click to interact, etc. This is just the top of the pyramid. We have very many statistics that are not designed for climate change, but are useful for that, about energy, transport, land use, agriculture, etc. So there are many colleagues in Eurostat and in statistical offices producing useful statistics for climate change. We just need to know the best way of communicating them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arturo. And for my next round of questions, I propose to keep Olivier and Peter already in the stream. And sorry, Arturo, but to replace you with Tekshi, and we will come back to you, Arturo, a bit later on. I would like to ask as a next question, maybe we can start with Peter. So if you come into a situation where colleagues from another country are asking you to, what is your main recommendation if you would like to start developing a set of climate change related indicators? What could be your recommendation to a particular country, or what would be your recommendation to international organizations to support countries in their efforts implement this kind of statistics? Peter.
My advice, and it might be a little bit controversial, is to be careful of indicator sets and indicator sets that demand lots of survey and sort of extra statistical collections, because it can actually cost a fair amount of resource, especially if you're trying to establish a collection in the first instance. My main advice is to look at the core sets of standards that national statistical organisations are already using and applying themselves to. So this is the family of economic standards, so SNA, balance of payments, government finance statistics, and also including the environmental ones, so SEEA and the ecosystems derivation. Start with those first and see what information you can derive that actually helps you to think about what are the sort of inputs into climate change, as well as the sort of externalities or result of changes that are due to sort of climate change. And as Arturo was suggesting, there's a lot of data that's produced by national statistical organisations. It's just aligning it and looking at the trends to see where those changes are taking place. On the social side of things, something we're noticing from the ecosystem side is it's useful to think about social capital as a framework for thinking about how society and the environment / climate change is actually starting to sort of move into the social sphere as well. So disease rates, mortality, behaviours in and around energy use and these sorts of things like that. So it's worth looking at those frameworks as you sort of think about how to measure the more social aspects of that. And for international organisations, yes, please, can we just stick with our standards?
All right. Point taken.
Yeah.
Okay. Olivier, what's your recommendation?
Yes, recommendation to person who want to start, and I'm sure that person on the way could confirm. I think there is many advantages to do that also at national level and for statistician. First, when we start, the first difficulties is to say, okay, we don't have methodology to do that. No, it's not true, because we have this international methodology, international metadata sheet, who explain indicator. So this difficulties is not anymore the case. And then the next steps is, of course, to search data to calculate this indicator. And doing that, first you will improve the quality of your existing data, because you will have a look to your data sources and see if the definitions, the scope are the same, if you could use it or not. And doing that, you better know your statistic and improve the quality of the statistics if you change a little bit, for example, the survey that you use. If you don't have the data, well, you search new data sources, and it will be nice also for your statistical system to develop new survey or take new technology like our colleague from Mongolia mentioning, perhaps use administrative register or other technology. Of course, doing that, calculating this list of climate change related indicator, you have new statistics, new information for user, for policy makers, and also you will create network with different experts, and as Angelica mentioning that you will discuss methodology. And I think that for us, we don't have enough this possibility to discuss methodology between national producer, and it's nice to compare inventories with environmental account and so on, and to recall what is the difference and what we should do to keep consistent between all of that. And last positive point, I think, is that doing that, you will highlight also new question for analysis and go in the direction of communication, better communication of our statistics. So many advantages to start this process, in my view.
Thank you, Olivier. Let me move to Tekshi. So what would be your main recommendation or main recommendations to countries or colleagues who would like to start this journey? Tekshi.
Okay, thank you. I think the environmental account is not like economic accounts. Environmental accounts need more information, more granular information, so that first you start to communicate other stakeholders. In my country, when we compile national account, we just collect information from the enterprises and households or somewhere. And when we compile the environmental accounts, we need to communicate the other organizations, other stakeholders. So first is you have to contact them and you have to communicate them. And after communicate them, you can get the better data. So this is my recommendation. Once you get the data, the easy to compile the accounts. This is the recommendation for the developers. For the international organizations, I asked the When we collect information and data, we need the financial support. And last year, I compiled the solid waste accounts and also water accounts. Uh, we don't have enough money. We can get the very good data. We cannot get the very good data. So sometimes we use some methodology to estimate some indicators. So my recommendation is raise the pound for the developing countries. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Tekshi. And Angelica, so what are your main recommendations to colleagues who are at the beginning of this journey, and international organizations, of course?
Okay, thanks. Just a few things because many things have been said already. I think that for producers, I would recommend to focus on certain areas to identify the priorities. So to invest a lot on priority areas for that, and also in the communication to try and understand where their issues really are. For example, I don't know, road transport, as Olivier was saying, in the case of Luxembourg, or a certain economic activity that has maybe a particularly high energy and emission intensity, or that that shows an increasing intensity over time. So identify clearly the priorities and communicate where the issues are, both highlighting positive examples and negative examples, of course. For the international organizations, I think that they know and can compare the methodologies that countries follow, and so they understand, of course, better than anyone else if the different data can be compared. Because all of us, of course, when we make analysis, we want to compare our national situation with the other of our countries, and sometimes in doing that we have a doubt. Does this difference with this other country, is it a real one, or it just depends on how data are developed? We found ourselves in this situation, for example, comparing our emissions of households with the households emission of other countries. We had this doubt at some point. Are we sure that we are comparing the same thing? So I think that, of course, Eurostat is doing an incredible job in validating the countries. So they did data, so they know if there are cases in which methodologies are not fully comparable, and it would be very, very useful to flag these cases as much as possible to help international comparison in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. And I would like to close this now with a question to Arturo, who has been, I'm sure, also been carefully listening to what has been said here. And Arturo, I would like to invite you to react to what you have heard here, if you wish. But I think it would be also interesting for us to hear from Eurostat, which I would call one of the custodians of the system of environmental. After what you've heard, do you think the SEEA is really fit enough for purpose, or do you see some specific needs for further development, or some specific guidance that countries might need now to better use it for producing climate change related information? Maybe also like an idea, what can Eurostat and other international organizations do to support countries in their efforts? So the floor is yours, Arturo.
Yes, thank you for those questions. I think I heard before that some speakers and something said the international organizations must provide the standards and provide the handbooks and guidelines and workshops like this one where we can talk the same language. I think we are already doing that to a large extent. It shouldn't be an excuse for countries to say, "Oh, I'm waiting until international organizations produce a standard." The standard exists. Our job is to continue supporting countries doing these things. Some things are already finished, but others are not finished. For instance, the standards are still getting developed for the ecosystem accounts. A great achievement was last year. And ecosystem accounts can play an important role also for climate change statistics because of carbon sequestration. Forests, for instance, and crops sequester carbon. So climate change is not only about greenhouse gas emissions, but also about sequestration. So standards are being developed, and we know this is part of our job. I also heard some of the speakers saying that we should provide financial support. That is correct. Eurostat provides this support, but unfortunately, we can only provide it to the members of the European Union, not to other countries. Also, we have some cooperation projects like N-Waves with third countries. But indeed, this is our responsibility, and we must continue doing our best there. I think something else where we really are shifting our energy, at least in Eurostat, once we have a brand name for SEEA, once we have some standards, we have already workshops, we have meetings, we have financial support. What else do we have to do? What we are trying to do now, and I think we should continue, is focusing a bit more in the communication, identifying best practices for communication, best ideas, so that we can learn from each other, provide a forum, meetings where we can discuss communication, continue developing applications of the accounts in, for instance, footprints that I mentioned before. This is something where, in particular for footprints that involve a lot of international flows of imports, exports, one single country cannot find the answers by itself. You really need the help of other countries and international organizations to know that your estimates of imports and exports of carbon are coherent with what the other countries are producing of imports, of exports of carbon. So we need to continue working together for footprints. Also, we can open the way about something I mentioned before, timeliness, improving timeliness with models. We can develop models and offer them to countries to get more timely estimates. And something else where I think we are doing things, but we still need to do more is to develop solutions to use in a combined way different thematic SEEA accounts. So we have SEEA accounts about greenhouse gas emissions, and we have SEEA accounts about energy use, and we have about the taxes, and we have about the jobs. But we are not able yet to fully use all the potential that information that we can deliver if we put together all that. In Eurostat, we did some work about this a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, for circular economy, and I think it was a successful one. We need to do the same thing again, and we are trying to do it now for climate change, to try to use different thematic accounts, SEEA accounts, that are not exclusively meant to be about climate change. For instance, energy accounts could be used for many things, not only about climate change, but they can also be used for climate change. So how to provide more guidance to countries about how can you combine your energy accounts with material flow accounts, with your forest accounts, with your greenhouse gas emission accounts, etc. And with these ecosystem accounts I mentioned before about carbon sequestration. How can you put it all together? Sometimes I say, and I think that the SEEA accounts are like the ingredients to prepare a meal. So you have flour, you have butter, you have salt, but then the users want a real meal. They don't want the flour, they want bread, for instance, or they want a prepared meal. So we have to combine the ingredients to prepare a meal for them and put the amount of salt or the amount of sugar that they want in their meal. So this is part of our job, and international organizations must help countries also to prepare meals with the ingredients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arturo, and I'm getting hungry now listening to your final sentences. So yeah, with that, we are at the end of our panel discussion, and I would like to really thank all of you for a very rich and very useful discussion. I think as a conclusion, very short conclusion, we can say there is no need to explain again the usefulness of using SEEA for informing climate change and other policy areas. I think without doubt there was a kind of common understanding among the experts. It's more, I think, about the challenges that are related to using it. Things that have been mentioned include the timeliness and the time lags of challenge, but also the communication, so that you need kind of groups of experts working on that and also making it available, this information for users in the right way, so that they understand what this is about, specifically when it comes to residence-based indicators next to territory-based indicators. It was also nice to see that, let's say, the most important SEEA accounts seem to be available. It's more a matter of using them and making them available for climate change policies, and also to hear a little bit about what international organizations can do to support countries in that regard. So I heard here to continue with providing platforms for exchange of experience, maybe to make tailor-made guidelines and things like this. But I think we can also say that there is a big learning curve when countries simply start little by little implementing climate change related statistics indicators, because actually what we've heard is also that you're learning on the way. And I think this is very important. We also can say, I think, that the EC set of core climate change related statistics and indicators provides a good starting point. But as Sam has mentioned a few, it's also important to look at national priorities and low hanging fruits. So I think with these three cornerstones, it's a good starting point for starters in this area. I also would like to use this opportunity to inform you about two regular events that we're hosting here at SEEA, which could be important and relevant for you to continue this discussion. So one is the upcoming joint OECD UNECE seminar on SEEA implementation, which will be on 28th, 30th, and 31st of March. So this is a platform, an annual platform, which allows for exchange of experience and knowledge in the area of SEEA production, but also use of SEEA in general. And of course, I would like to promote a bit the expert forum for producers and users of climate change related statistics, which of course has the focus on the production of climate change related statistics indicators. And the next one will be 29th and 30th of September this year, and more information will follow. I leave it here because we are running out of time, and I hand over to Gosha.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this comprehensive summary. We are just going to take a few more minutes for the official closing of the meeting. For that, I would invite Elena Friso from EFTA to join me. Elena is the administrative coordinator of the EFTA Statistical Office, and we've been working hand in hand on putting this meeting together. And right after the meeting, you will get the link to the evaluation form. Please tell us what you think about the webinars, what we should improve in the future. Your honest opinion is very important to us and will help us in the future event. And before I hand over to Elena for a few words, I wanted to thank myself on behalf of myself and Michael and all the organizing committee, to all the persons who accepted our invitation to be part of the two webinars, to share their knowledge, their experience, and also some changes and issues, because this event could not have happened without them. And we are extremely grateful that they are still willing to share their knowledge with the whole community. We thank very much to all of you, the participants of this meeting, for your active participations, good questions and comments. And we hope the event was useful to you and wish you best of luck in your further work. Please do keep an eye on the events coming up later this year on the SEEA accounts and on climate change statistics in the autumn. And last but not least, I thank our main partner, EFTA, for their financial support and great collaboration on putting the event together, but also the National Statistical Committee of the Kyrgyz Republic and UNESCAP, that was part of the organizing committee. And I also thank the interpreters and Interprefy colleagues for your great work, and also the EFTA colleagues who have been patiently switching on and off all the speakers. So Elena, to you for last final words.
Thanks, Gasha. So on behalf of EFTA, let me thank all the speakers again for being with us and sharing their experiences, their time and work done for making this event happening. Hope this was and could be helpful for all the participants to better advance in their activities. As concerned the support, EFTA works closely with the ECA countries and not only, and also in collaboration and in cooperation with the UNECE and also Eurostat. So in case this is your need, you can request from requests from national statistical offices can be submitted to the EFTA and we will evaluate them. You can find my email address in the website page. Hope this can help. After this event, an evaluation questionnaire will be sent out. I kindly invite you all to participate at this series of webinar was built upon the request of some participants at the previous series of webinars, which was organized in 2020. So if you have specific requests to address us, please let us know and we will carefully look at for any further future event. Whether you would like to watch the previous webinars, please go to the EFTA website. You could find all the videos in English and also we will be uploaded. Also the Russian version will be soon uploaded. All the presentations are available both in English and Russian, are already online. After this event, we will work also on uploading today and yesterday's sessions as for you to watch them during the next month. All the presentations are already there online and the material will be permanently online. The mentioned link to Eurostat website will also be added. So look at that as well. Once again, it was a great pleasure for me to work for the success of this event together with the UNECE colleagues. Deep thanks to you, Gosha and Michael, for the amazing work done. Thanks to my colleagues also in EFTA for helping run this event. Apologies to the Russian speakers which experienced some issues during the event. We work on the background with the Interprefy support to quickly solve this. Hope your participation at these sessions